The winds howled through the dense forest, the scent of pine heavy in the air. In the distance the moon hung like a silver coin, illuminating the figure of a lone traveler making their way through the mist. His cloak, dark and tattered, billowed behind him with every step. He moved with purpose, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. With each stride, the weight of his mission seemed to grow heavier. He paused for a moment, scanning the surroundings with a steely gaze. "I must find them," he muttered under his breath, his voice low and filled with determination. His name was Alaric, and his search was one of vengeance. Years had passed since his family was slaughtered by the mysterious organization that now haunted his every step. But tonight, the game would change. Tonight, he would make them pay. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of unseen voices. Alaric's eyes darted to the shadows, a faint rustle coming from somewhere in the darkness. He wasn't alone. He knew that much. It had been too quiet for too long. Then a figure emerged from the mist, her presence as sudden and silent as a wolf's shadow. She wore a dark cloak similar to his, her face obscured by the hood, but her eyes gleamed with a dangerous knowledge. "Alaric," she said softly, her voice a whisper of steel. "I've been waiting for you." Alaric's hand instinctively tightened on his sword, but he remained still, watching her closely. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cold but controlled. "A friend," she replied with a smirk. "Or an enemy? That depends on you." The woman stepped closer, her movements fluid and purposeful. She seemed to glide through the mist, a predator in her own right. Alaric could sense her power, the quiet confidence in her every gesture. "I know what you're looking for," she said, her voice a low whisper that seemed to echo through the trees. "But it's not something you can find alone." Alaric's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly do you want?" he asked. The woman's lips curled into a sly smile. "I want the same thing you do, to bring them to justice." Alaric studied her for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. There was something about her that didn't sit right, but he couldn't deny the truth in her statement. They were after the same enemy, and if her words held any weight, she could prove useful. The wind had died down, leaving only the heavy silence of the forest. The woman, now revealed as Ira, stood before Alaric, her stance unwavering. "I've been tracking them for years," she said, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of countless battles fought in shadows. Alaric watched her carefully, his suspicion growing. "And why should I trust you?" he asked, his hand still resting near his sword, ready for whatever might come next. Ira's lips curved into a faint smile. "Because like you, I've lost everything to them. We have the same enemy, and as much as it may pain you to admit it, you'll need my help to bring them down." Alaric's thoughts raced, torn between his desire for vengeance and the logic in her words. "So what's the plan?" he asked, his voice low as his mind began to shift. Ira met his gaze directly. "We track them down one step at a time, but we need to be careful. They will have eyes everywhere." Alaric nodded, the weight of the journey ahead settling over him. "Then we begin." Alaric and Ira moved through the forest with renewed purpose, their steps synchronized as they trekked toward their destination. The path ahead was unclear, obscured by dense underbrush and the creeping fog, but Alaric's resolve remained unwavering. "Where are we headed?" he asked, his voice steady, but his eyes scanning the surroundings. Ira glanced at him, her eyes gleaming with quiet confidence. "A place where the Veil's influence runs deep," she said. "An old ruin. It's where they regrouped after the last major strike. We'll find answers there." Alaric nodded, though a question lingered in his mind. "And when we do find them, what then?" Ira's lips curled into a determined smile. "Then we strike. We won't let them escape again." The urgency in her tone matched his own growing anticipation. They were on the cusp of something bigger than themselves, and Alaric could feel the weight of the coming storm in every step they took. The woman's gaze hardened as she spoke, her eyes never leaving Alaric. "They are closer than you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alaric shifted his stance, his mind racing. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath as the mist thickened, swirling like a living thing. Who are they? What do they want? Alaric's voice was sharp, edged with frustration. The woman stepped closer, her movements deliberate and calm. They are a shadow, a force that has pulled the strings in this land for years, she replied. But they won't stop with your family, Alaric. They want power, and they'll do whatever it takes to seize it. Alaric's jaw clenched as the weight of her words settled over him. He had suspected as much. Then we find them, he said firmly, his voice full of resolve. And we make them pay. The woman's lips curled into a smile, though it lacked warmth. That is the plan, she said. The next morning, the sun barely broke through the thick canopy above, casting a soft golden light on the dew-covered ground. Alaric and the woman traveled in silence, the forest now feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a labyrinth. Tell me your name, Alaric finally demanded, breaking the silence. The woman glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Ira, she said simply. Now you know. Alaric studied her for a moment, the hint of skepticism still in his eyes. And why are you helping me? He asked. Ira paused for a moment, before responding. Because we have a common enemy, she said quietly. And because you have no idea what you're truly walking into. Alaric's mind raced, but he didn't press her further. There were things he needed to know, but time was running out. He could feel it. The further they traveled, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew darker, their bark twisted and gnarled, as if they had been scarred by time itself. Alaric felt a strange sense of unease settle over him, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Something isn't right, he muttered, glancing at Ira. She didn't answer immediately, but her pace quickened. They know we're coming, she said softly, her eyes scanning the shadows. Alaric's heart raced as he pulled his sword from its sheath. Who? He demanded. But Ira didn't answer. Instead, she moved faster, her steps quick and precise. Alaric followed her, his senses heightened. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't alone, and neither was she. Suddenly, a piercing howl echoed through the forest, followed by the distant sound of footsteps, heavy and purposeful. Alaric's heart skipped a beat. Get down, Ira hissed, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him into the shadows. They crouched low, barely breathing, as a group of figures emerged from the fog. They were cloaked in black, their faces obscured by hoods. Silent, calculated, they moved like predators hunting their prey. Alaric's grip tightened on his sword, but Ira's hand on his arm was a warning. Not yet, she whispered. They're not our problem yet. The figures moved past them, unaware of their presence. But Alaric's gaze lingered, a knot of fear twisting in his gut. Who were they? And why did they look so familiar? Once the figures had passed, Ira and Alaric moved swiftly, staying low and staying silent. Ira glanced at him with a cryptic expression. You were right to be cautious, she said. They are one of the factions I've been hunting, but they are only part of the greater puzzle. Alaric didn't respond, his mind still reeling from the sight of the cloaked figures. He knew they were more than they appeared. He could feel it in his bones. Who are they? He finally asked. Ira hesitated for a moment. They are the Order of the Veil, she said. A secretive faction tied to the group you seek, but they are not the true enemy. Alaric's brow furrowed. Then who is? He asked, his voice low. Ira turned to him, her face hardening. The ones who control them. Her words sent a chill down his spine. The true enemy was still hidden in the shadows. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before them, a maze of towering trees and winding paths. The tension between Alaric and Ira lingered in the air, but the silence was broken only by the sounds of their footsteps crunching on the leaf-strewn ground. As they moved deeper, the trees began to thin, revealing a clearing in the distance. Alaric's eyes narrowed as he spotted movement within the clearing. Figures were gathered around a large fire, their shadows flickering in the flames. Ira's hand shot out, stopping him in his tracks. "Don't engage," she whispered urgently. Alaric looked at her, confused. "Why? There are enemies." Ira's expression was one of hesitation, her eyes scanning the clearing. "They're more than just enemies. They're a part of the Veil. We need to learn more, not just attack blindly." Alaric clenched his jaw but nodded. "Then we wait." Hours passed as they observed the cloaked figures from the shadows. Alaric grew restless, his patience wearing thin. "How much longer are we going to wait?" he whispered. Ira's gaze never wavered from the figures. "Patience," she replied. "We need to understand their plans before we act. There's more going on here than you know." Alaric's brow furrowed, the weight of her words sinking in. "How long have you been hunting them?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Ira finally turned her head to meet his eyes. And then you delved a framework of the to his eyes. "Too long," she said with a grim smile. "But every step brings us closer. We just have to be smart about it." Alaric nodded, trying to push aside his impatience. They had come this far, and he would follow her lead, at least for now. The flickering firelight illuminated their faces, highlighting the tension in their eyes. Suddenly, a voice rose from the group by the fire, its tone low and commanding. "The time is near," the figure said, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. Alaric's attention snapped to the group, his body tensing. "They're planning something," he murmured to Ira. Ira nodded subtly, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "They're not just here to hide," she whispered back. "They're preparing for something big." Alaric's heart began to race. "What kind of plan could they have?" he asked, his voice tight with unease. "Something dangerous," Ira replied grimly. "And we need to stop it." Alaric glanced at the fire again, his mind already racing with the implications of what the cloaked figures were plotting. This was no ordinary group. It was something much larger and far more dangerous. Ira motioned for Alaric to stay low as the conversation by the fire continued. Her eyes flicked over the figures, studying their movements, and then back to Alaric. "They're waiting for something," she said, her voice barely audible. "We can't risk moving in until we know what it is." Alaric's grip tightened on his sword, the temptation to act nearly overwhelming. "I've had enough of waiting," he muttered. "I say we strike now." But Ira stopped him with a firm hand on his arm. "Patience," she urged, her voice steady. "You're not just fighting them. You're fighting their entire system. We need to know how they operate, where they're weakest." Alaric met her gaze, his frustration evident. But he saw the wisdom in her eyes, and reluctantly he stepped back. "We wait," he said through clenched teeth. As the night wore on, the cloaked figures began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the distance. Ira watched them go, her expression unreadable. "Now," she whispered, rising to her feet. Alaric followed her, his sword drawn and ready. The two moved swiftly, silently through the trees, their movements fluid and calculated. As they approached the fire, the remnants of the conversation lingered in Alaric's mind. "We've learned all we can for now," Ira said, her voice low. "But this is only the beginning. They're not the final piece. We need to find where their true leaders are hiding." Alaric nodded, his eyes scanning the now empty clearing. "Then let's find them," he said, his voice full of resolve. The fire crackled behind them as they moved deeper into the forest, ready to face whatever came next. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air grew colder, the trees more twisted and gnarled, as if the forest itself had become part of the dark forces they were chasing. Ira moved with a certain grace, as though she knew exactly where she was going, but Alaric's mind was elsewhere. The figures they had seen earlier, those who called themselves the Order of the Veil, were only the beginning. The true threat still loomed in the shadows, and it was closer than they realized. "We're getting closer," Ira said, her voice low but firm. Alaric looked at her, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "How do you know?" he asked. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze locked on the path ahead. "Trust me," she said simply. I've walked this path before. Alaric remained silent, following her without question, though his unease grew with each step. They were heading straight into danger. As they moved deeper into the forest, the ground beneath them began to shift. The underbrush thickened, and the path became less clear, as if the forest itself was trying to conceal something. Ira slowed her pace, her eyes scanning the area with heightened awareness. "We're close," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alaric looked around, his grip on his sword tightening. The tension in the air was palpable, and he could feel the weight of something watching them, waiting. "What are we looking for?" he asked. Ira hesitated for a moment before responding. "A place where the veil gathers," she said quietly. "A stronghold, hidden deep in the forest." Alaric's heart raced at the thought of what they might find. The Order of the Veil had already proven to be dangerous, and now they were about to uncover the heart of their operations. "Let's make sure we're ready for whatever's waiting," Alaric muttered. The clearing came into view suddenly, the trees parting to reveal a strange and eerie sight. At the center stood a large stone structure, half hidden by the overgrowth of moss and vines. The air around it was still, as though it were holding its breath. "This is it," Ira whispered, her voice barely audible. Alaric took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the structure. It was ancient, its stone walls cracked and weathered, but there was no mistaking its purpose. This was a place of power. "We need to be careful," Alaric murmured. Ira nodded in agreement, her expression grim. "The Veil has long used this place as a sanctuary, but they've moved their operations elsewhere," she said, her voice cold. "Still, there are traps here, remnants of what they left behind, and they may still be watching." Alaric's eyes hardened, a quiet determination taking over. "Then let's find out what they left." They approached the structure with caution, each step deliberate as if the very ground beneath them might betray them. Alaric's instincts were on high alert, his every sense tuned to the slightest movement or sound. "Stay close," Ira murmured, her hand brushing the hilt of her dagger. She moved with an unsettling quietness, as though she were one with the shadows. Alaric followed, the weight of the silence pressing in on him. They reached the stone doorway, its massive archway dark and foreboding. Ira pushed against the stone, and with a low groan the door creaked open. The darkness within seemed to swallow the light. "What's inside?" Alaric asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ira stepped forward, her face set with resolve. "Answers," she said. "And danger. That'll work too." The interior of the structure was colder than Alaric expected, the air thick with the scent of moss and stone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. Ira led the way, her footsteps soundless, as though she had done this many times before. Alaric followed closely, his sword ready. The deeper they went, the darker it became, and the more Alaric's unease grew. "How far does this place go?" he asked, his voice tense. "Far enough," Ira replied, her voice a whisper in the stillness. They reached the end of the narrow passage, where a stone door stood closed. Ira's hand hovered over the surface, her fingers brushing against the cool stone. "This is it," she said. "Behind this door lies what remains of the Veil's secrets." Alaric took a step forward, his mind racing. Whatever lay behind that door could change everything. Ira's fingers traced the stone door, her touch gentle yet purposeful. Alaric stood behind her, his eyes scanning their surroundings, the stillness of the structure growing almost unbearable. The weight of the moment was palpable. Whatever lay beyond this door, they were ready for it. At least, that's what Alaric told himself. "We should be ready for anything," Alaric muttered, adjusting his grip on his sword. Ira turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "This isn't just about fighting," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's about understanding. The Veil is not just a group, it's an ideology, a force that has shaped this land for years." Alaric nodded, his mind racing with the implications of her words. "Then, let's get this over with," he said, his voice firm. Ira nodded silently and pushed the door open, revealing the chamber beyond. The room was vast, its stone walls rising high into darkness, leaving only a faint glow from the brazier to illuminate the space. Alaric's gaze shifted around the chamber, taking in the piles of old scrolls, artifacts, and strange relics scattered about. Ira stepped further into the room, her eyes flicking over everything with a sense of familiarity. "This place, it's where they kept their most important secrets," she said softly, her voice laced with a mix of reverence and disdain. Alaric moved cautiously, his boots making no sound against the stone floor. "And now we're here to uncover them," he replied. Ira didn't answer immediately, but walked towards a pedestal at the far side of the room. She reached for a large worn book resting there. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The key to their plans." Ira opened the book, the brittle pages creaking under her touch as if they hadn't been disturbed in centuries. The symbols on the pages were unfamiliar, and the text appeared ancient and cryptic. Alaric leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the writing. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Ira ran her fingers along the lines of text, her brow furrowing as she tried to decipher the words. "It's not just a language," she murmured. "It's a code." Alaric's heart began to race as he realized the magnitude of what they had found. "A code for what?" he demanded. Ira looked up at him, her expression grim. "For the final stages of their plan, this is how they're going to take control. They've been orchestrating this for years." Alaric took a step back, his mind reeling with the implications. "We have to stop them," he said, his voice low with urgency. As Ira continued to examine the book, Alaric's attention was drawn to a strange noise coming from deeper within the chamber. His hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword, and he motioned for Ira to be silent. They both listened intently, the sound growing louder. Footsteps, slow but deliberate. "We're not alone," Alaric whispered. Ira closed the book with a snap, her eyes darting to the shadows at the far end of the chamber. "Stay low," she instructed. Alaric nodded, his muscles tensing as he prepared for whatever danger might emerge. The footsteps grew closer, the air thickening with the presence of another. And then a figure stepped into the light. A cloaked figure, its face hidden in shadow. "I was wondering when you'd find this place," the figure said, its voice smooth and cold. "You're too late." The figure's voice echoed in the silence, and Alaric's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice firm. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "I am the one who ensures that the Veil's plans remain on course," the figure replied, their voice smooth, almost mocking. Ira's eyes narrowed, her hand inching toward the dagger at her side. "You work for them," she said, her voice low with disgust. The figure laughed, the sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "We all work for the Veil, in one way or another," the figure replied cryptically. Alaric's patience wore thin. "Why are you here?" he asked again. The figure's eyes gleamed with an unsettling light. "To make sure you don't interfere any further. The time for your rebellion is over." Without warning, the figure lunged forward, a blade flashing from beneath the cloak. The figure's blade flashed through the air with frightening speed, but Alaric was faster. He stepped to the side, his sword meeting the figure's in a sharp clash of metal. The sound reverberated through the chamber, ringing in Alaric's ears. Ira moved swiftly, her dagger slicing through the air as she struck at the cloaked figure's exposed side. But the figure twisted, narrowly evading the blow, and pulled back, laughing softly. "You think you can stop us?" the figure sneered, their voice dripping with arrogance. Alaric's eyes burned with fury. "You're not going to get away with this," he growled, stepping forward, sword raised. Ira stayed close, her eyes locked on the figure, poised for another strike. "We'll see," the figure said, their tone mocking. With a sudden, fluid motion, they raised their hand, and the room seemed to tremble. A pulse of dark energy surged from the figure, knocking both Alaric and Ira back with brutal force. The blast of dark energy sent Alaric crashing into the stone wall, his vision momentarily blurred by the force of the impact. He grunted in pain, pushing himself off the cold, rough stone. Ira was already back on her feet, her movements fluid as she rushed to his side. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice tense. Alaric nodded, though his ribs ached from the force of the blast. "I'm fine, but we need to end this." They both turned to face the cloaked figure, who was now standing tall in the center of the room, their cloak billowing as if they were feeding off the dark energy. "You're strong," the figure said, their voice laced with amusement. "But strength isn't enough." The figure raised their hand again, and the room seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer. "This is the power of the veil, and you're too late to stop it." Alaric gritted his teeth, his sword held firmly in his hand. "We'll see about that." Ira's eyes flashed with a dangerous resolve. She took a step forward, moving toward the figure with fluid precision. "We're not afraid of your shadows," she spat, her dagger gleaming in the dim light. Alaric followed her lead, his grip tightening on his sword. "We've come this far," he said, his voice full of fury. "We're not backing down now." The cloaked figure's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Fools," they hissed. "You think you can defeat what has already been set in motion?" With that, they raised both hands, summoning a torrent of dark energy that filled the room with a bone-chilling force. Alaric and Era braced themselves, the wind whipping through the chamber as the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them like a storm. But Alaric wasn't about to back down. He lunged forward, sword raised high, determined to strike the figure down before they could unleash any more of their dark power. The clash was deafening. Alaric's sword collided with the dark energy, creating a shockwave that reverberated through the entire chamber. He staggered back, feeling the force of the blow reverberating through his bones. Ira, however, was faster. She ducked beneath the swirling shadows, using her speed and agility to close the gap between herself and the figure. In one swift motion, she struck, her dagger finding its mark. The figure let out a strangled gasp, their hand going to the wound in their side. "You think you've won," the figure rasped, their voice laced with fury. Ira stepped back, her eyes narrowing. "Not yet," she said coldly, ready for the next move. Alaric steadied himself, raising his sword once more. "But we're getting closer," he added, his voice low and determined. The figure's eyes burned with rage. "This isn't over," they spat, before vanishing into the shadows. The figure's form dissolved into the shadows, leaving Alaric and Era standing alone in the center of the chamber. The darkness began to recede, but the tension in the air remained thick. Ira let out a slow breath, her eyes still scanning the room for any signs of danger. "What just happened?" Alaric asked, his voice full of disbelief. Ira didn't immediately answer, instead walking toward the spot where the figure had vanished. "They're gone for now," she said, her voice steady but weary. "But they've only shown us a fraction of what they're capable of. This fight is far from over." Alaric sheathed his sword, his eyes hardened by the knowledge that their battle was far from finished. "Then we'll be ready," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "Let's finish what we started." Ira nodded silently, her face set with determination. Together, they turned and began to make their way back toward the exit, ready to face whatever dangers awaited them next. The forest outside the structure was eerily quiet as Alaric and Era made their way toward the edge of the clearing. The battle within had left them both physically and mentally exhausted, but the real fight was far from over. Ira's eyes were distant as she walked, clearly lost in thought. "They're regrouping," Alaric said, his voice grim. "They won't give up that easily." Ira nodded, her gaze locked ahead. "No, they won't," she said quietly. "And neither can we." Her words carried a weight, a certainty that resonated deep within Alaric. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The Veil's true leaders were still out there, pulling the strings behind the scenes, and it was up to them to stop them. "So what's next?" Alaric asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Ira paused, her eyes meeting his. "We find them, and we make sure they can never hurt anyone again." As they ventured deeper into the forest, Alaric couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the leaves sent his senses on high alert. Ira, however, remained calm, her movements smooth and calculated. "They're close," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Alaric glanced at her. "How do you know?" he asked. "I can feel it," she replied. "The pull of their power, like a thread that stretches through the trees, always watching, always waiting." Alaric's heart raced. "Then we're walking into a trap," he said, his voice sharp. Ira didn't answer immediately, her eyes scanning the path ahead. "Not a trap," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "A test. They want to see if we're worthy of reaching them." "And we will." Alaric nodded, determination setting in. "Then let's pass it." Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to shake, the trees quivering as though the forest itself was alive. Alaric's hand went to his sword, his muscles tensing as he scanned their surroundings. "It's them," Ira said quietly, her voice steady. "They've found us." The ground continued to tremble, and Alaric's eyes narrowed in focus. He could feel the energy building around them, a dark presence gathering in the air. Then, from the shadows of the trees, figures emerged, cloaked in darkness, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them and Alaric and Era in an instant. "Ready yourself," Ira whispered. "This is only the beginning." Alaric's grip tightened on his sword. "Then let's finish it." The figures were upon them in an instant, and the battle was fierce. Alaric's sword clashed with the dark blades of their attackers, each strike sending shockwaves through the air. Ira was a blur of movement, her dagger flashing in the moonlight as she fought with a deadly grace. But despite their skill and resolve, the figures kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Alaric's breath was ragged, his body screaming for rest, but he refused to give in. "We can't keep this up forever," he yelled, his voice strained. Ira's eyes met his, her expression unwavering. "Then we don't have forever," she replied, her voice calm but filled with urgency. "We need to reach their leader. They're just the shadows. The true enemy is waiting." Alaric nodded, his mind racing as he fought. "Then we move forward," he said, determination lacing his words. Now. In the midst of the battle, a figure stepped forward from the shadows, taller and more imposing than the others. Their cloak was darker, the edges lined with intricate symbols that pulsed with dark energy. "You think you can stop the veil?" the figure said, their voice low and resonant, carrying an authority that sent a chill through Alaric's bones. "You are nothing but pawns in a game you cannot understand." Alaric's breath caught in his throat as the figure raised their hand, and the forest seemed to fall silent, the air thickening with the power emanating from them. "We understand enough to know that you have to be stopped," Alaric said, his voice unwavering. "And we will be the ones to do it." Ira stepped forward, her eyes hard. "Your reign ends here." The figure smiled coldly. "We shall see," they said, before raising their hand once more, unleashing a final burst of dark energy.